Today, members, we have a presentation from the Michigan State Police regarding the Datamaster validation issues. Today, you should have in front of you, there's two letters. One is dated January 10, 2020, and the other one's dated is the official statement from the Michigan State Police dated January 13th, 3 days later, 2020. At this time, I would like to welcome Colonel Joseph Jasper, as well as Michael Nichols, as well as Patrick Reynolds. What do they call this again, Madam Clerk?
Testimony table.
Testimony table. Welcome, gentlemen.
We have 2 chairs and 3 people.
Oh.
This is the citizens.
You're welcome to pull the chair.
Pull up a chair.
Oh, we have it right here for you.
Here we go. Thanks, Sarge. Can you kind of fit it in the middle because we have microphones? We want everybody to hear. Thank you very much. Members of the committee, these two letters are very important for you to discern while the testimony is given, but at this time, I would like to welcome Senator Jasper, Colonel Jasper. Not yet. Colonel, good morning. Welcome to the committee. Would you begin the testimony?
Good morning.
Thank you for asking me here today.
Can you pull the mic a little closer? Sorry to interrupt you, but we want to hear you.
Thank you. The issue that I'm here to discuss is one of great importance, and I want to assure you that I understand the gravity of this situation, and I am completely committed to partnering with all of our stakeholders to rectify the situation as quickly as possible and to work to restore the public's faith. The people will receive the due process that they deserve from our criminal justice system. I'd like to start by giving a very brief overview of how we got to where we are today and to provide some updated and new information not previously shared. On September 1st of 2018, the MSP entered into a 3-year, $1.26 million contract with Intoximeters Incorporated to service and maintain the state's 203 Datamaster DMT evidential breath alcohol testing instruments. This is the instrument that you see here before you, to my right, to your left. It is not the roadside portable breath test, which is known as the PBT, which is the smaller instrument on the other side of the Datamaster. The contract requires the vendor's 3 technicians to conduct the 120-day certifications of all instruments, perform service calls and routine maintenance, and provide court testimony on the service and maintenance of the instruments. On January 2nd of this year, during a routine audit of documents submitted by the vendor for the prior 2-week period, MSP staff noticed an irregularity on an instrument at the Alpena County Sheriff's Department, and we immediately requested the original documents from the technician. With this information, we immediately opened a criminal investigation into possible forgery of a public document. This investigation is ongoing. The next day, we worked with DTMB Central Procurement to issue a stop work order with the vendor and secure all equipment and paperwork from the 3 technicians. On Friday, January 10th, we finalized an emergency plan to immediately bring all maintenance responsibilities for the state's 203 instruments in-house and notified our public safety partners of the stop work order and our new responsibilities. MSP personnel continued through the weekend to review records from the technicians, yielding additional discrepancies involving a second technician and 3 more impacted instruments located at Beverly Hills Police Department, Pittsfield Township Police Department, and Tecumseh Police Department, in which we suspect instrument calibration tests were again fabricated. Armed with this new information, we made the extreme move to remove all 203 instruments from service until they could be inspected by MSP personnel and verified to be properly calibrated. Notification was again made to our law enforcement partners, at which time we recommended that police agencies utilize blood draws rather than breath tests to establish evidence of drunk driving during this interim period. We are still in the process of reviewing vendor records and will be for some time, but possible discrepancies have been identified to date involving 8 instruments impacting a total of 52 drunk driving cases. The breakdown of these cases is included in the documents that you were provided. The MSP is working as expeditiously as possible to review additional vendor records to identify any other potentially impacted instruments. At this time, we have no reason to believe that these issues predate the employment of these two technicians, who were hired in September and November of 2018. We are also aggressively working to bring instruments back into service as quickly and as efficiently as possible. As of this morning, we have certified 37 instruments. Our plan of attack is to recertify the most frequently used instruments and those in areas with limited access to obtaining blood samples first. Senator, as a longtime attorney, you are keenly aware that breath test results, while relied upon heavily for prosecution, are not required. In many cases, there is other evidence of intoxication and impairment, such as observed driving, sobriety tests, and witness observations that provide indications of drunk driving. I in no way want to diminish the role of the breath test, as we are very confident a properly calibrated and maintained Datamaster is an extremely reliable instrument. But every drunk driving case presents a unique set of facts, making it difficult to say that all or even most drunk driving convictions or pleas are now in question. I want to emphasize that we are committed to conducting a thorough and complete investigation into this matter, and if we can prove criminal acts occurred, we will pursue criminal charges against those responsible. I have personally spoken to the Attorney General, who has pledged the full support of her office on both the criminal and civil fronts. In consultation with the AG's office and DTMB, we will aggressively pursue any redress available to the department, including possible legal action against the vendor to recoup the costs borne by the state. As I wrap up my initial remarks, I want to recognize the substantial impact that this situation has on everyone in the criminal justice community, from my fellow officers to prosecutors and defense attorneys, as well as the courts. I pledge my commitment to being as transparent as possible as we work to make improvements to the state's breath alcohol program and restore the public's trust. Thank you.
Appreciate that statement. I know that we're going to be handed a copy of the same because we don't have it as part of our record. And thanks for being candid, open, and honest with that statement about you're going to do your best to cure the defect, because you said it is the hallmark, and those are my words, of our justice system, the evidence that we rely on as prosecutors, defense lawyers, police officers, and judges that ultimately have the upper hand on what to do. So thank you, and thank you for these other documents, bringing them with us today. I'd like to have you demonstrate, before we get to the other side, exactly how this instrument works for the benefit of everybody on the committee. Just, you can give a brief synopsis and show us what the PBT does, portable breath test on the road, versus the chemical test inside the station, if you can.
Right. Excuse me. So the smaller instrument is the PBT instrument that the majority of law enforcement carries in the state. And that instrument is, again, used on, thank you, sir. This is used on the roadside, and it is, as you can see, very portable as in comparison to the Datamaster. So once this device is deployed, then at that point, oftentimes the next step would be that official sample that would be taken, that based on statute provides a breath sample, a blood sample, or a urine sample. So in the event that the officer chooses to request the breath sample, then he or she would take the individual to a facility that has that the Datamaster device, and then as it's calibrated, each officer is trained on how to use the device. It is not something that goes without training. You have to be certified on the device to be able to use it, and you implement the test. Upon completion of the test, there is a very specific piece of paper or a ticket that is generated that indicates the results, and then obviously that is included in paperwork that is ultimately passed on to the prosecutor's office and the court system.
Well, pretty good. Nice job.
Thank you, sir.
So I'm pulled over. You come up as a police officer, believe that the individual who was pulled over has been drinking by way of speaking to me, my eyes, whatever. And then at that point, you can request sobriety test. You can remove them from the car, heel to toe, which means walk in a straight line, touch your nose, dexterity test, all these different set of tests. And then subsequently, or at the end, you can ask them to take a PBT to get a read on blood alcohol, but it's not admissible in a court of law.
Correct.
Okay. If there's enough on the PBT and the failure of the sobriety test at roadside, then you can go ahead and put them in custody and bring them in because they're a threat to society of being on the road.
Yes, sir.
All right. Once they get to the station, then the chemical test, which is this machine here to my left, your right, is fired up to get a read with a little pink coupon, it's called, that's spit out of this machine to get the blood alcohol level of the individual.
Yes, sir.
If they refuse this test in the station, then 6 points can be applied to their driver's license and loss of license for up to 6 months. Correct?
Yes, there are additional issues.
Additional issues, and we'll leave it at that for simplicity today.
Yes, sir.
In addition, you have a right as the officer to request of them to take a blood or urine test, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. You indicated that there's irregularities that you found with the audit. What were the irregularities so that we're all aware what those mean?
So there were two basic irregularities without going into the specifics of how the document, the report was actually fraudulently crafted. We have an irregularity in making sure that the technician met the 120-day window at which time they are supposed to touch each instrument. So that's the first irregularity that was repeated multiple times. The second issue are these reports that once they touch these instruments, they are then required to generate a report. That report is then sent to the Michigan State Police. It's these reports that we have identified the irregularities, anything from bad dates and times to alignment issues on the report. As you know, Senator, these tickets, these pink coupons that are generated are formatted in a very specific way. And so when you have letters or numbers that are not in line, that is another indication of that.
When you indicated, so that we're clear, 52 drunk driving cases, roughly, there's 203 instruments. And the question I have is, has there been an exhaustive audit of all these instruments that are within the state?
We are currently in the process of doing that. We have 6 trained MSP personnel who have the ability, based on training, to perform these calibrations. And so as we are able to obtain equipment for all 6 of these members to be out there testing, that is the plan, is to bring these, every single one of these devices back to what we know is a baseline.
Baseline or compliance?
Yes, sir.
And the instrument, even the manual, so everybody knows, has to have the calibration and service within the 120 days because that's what's outlined in the manual.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I could go on, but I'm gonna want to open up for questions of the committee because I think this is a learning process for us all. And at the end of the day, how many Datamasters, and that's what this is called, you said there's a 203 that the state police have in service? Is that a yes?
Yes.
Out of the 203, is there more Datamasters out there, or that's all of the data masters.
That's all of the data masters in the state.
So some of the counties that we all are in, may only have one data master that every agency brings the individual to take the test?
That is possible, yes.
Okay. And the company that is the third-party vendor with the state of Michigan, who is that company that services the data master that you rely on for compliance with the manual?
It's Intoximeters Incorporated.
Do you know approximately how much Intoximeters is paid by the state to keep up the certification of these machines?
The contract is $1.26 million.
1.26 million?
Yes, sir.
Thanks. And you're relying upon them to do their job as all of us would when we rely upon our people that we have here in the state to do their job?
Yes, sir.
Okay. This time I'm going to open up to questions. Senator Chang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Colonel, for your testimony and for your work to address the situation. This is a really helpful timeline. Thanks for providing it. I noticed that in January of last year, you mentioned that you created a new position, the technical leader, and then just this past December that you've begun the process of establishing a unit to oversee this program that'll include 3 technician positions to conduct maintenance and certification. Where are you in the process on both of those things? And can you describe a little bit more about what that oversight will look like and how often, and just a little bit more detail about that oversight?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. So, yes, as we have observed the technicalities of this particular instrument and the science involved in the analysis and using the instruments, we've made the decision that it really does need to come into our laboratory system, having very strong internal controls, which is exactly what caught this, particularly in line with our accreditation. There's a very high level of responsibility as the accrediting agency comes in and goes over our information. So the decision was made to hire a technical leader, which we did. That person is actually the exact individual who discovered these issues. As we started to discover the issues, we started to move in the direction of potentially bringing this in-house to increase the number of checks and balances. This situation that we currently have obviously has jump-started that, so we do intend to hire 3 technicians that will ultimately do what these 3 technicians are not doing, or at least 2 of these technicians are not doing. And we will also include our internal control auditor to validate data, processes, and procedures, and then also look for an external scientist to come in and again validate what we have. Now that's all on top of the tight issues that we are going to have to address when we seek calibration accreditation through the accrediting agency that will ultimately result in very strong internal controls.
Just to follow up, when was the person hired, the technical leader? Was that person hired prior to these, the August cases that started?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? Senator Chang. Senator Vanderwall, and then Senator Irwin, you need some questions answered? Thank you. Senator Vanderwall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. It's very similar to Senator Chang's. In what I caught from we feel that there's 2 technicians that may have fraudulently, and possibly 3. How many do they have, total technicians? Just 3?
Yes, sir. They just have 3 that have 3 different areas of responsibilities for the state.
Okay. And I guess, just so my clarification, how would they basically affect that report? How do they go in and, I'm gonna use the term fudge the lines a little bit to make it look better, or I guess I don't really understand that piece.
Right, so, what it appears is that, this is a traditional cut and paste, not a electronic cut and paste, but where they took, it appears, as though they took some of the tickets, they cut them, and then they taped them back together in a format that closely resembled, but the data is critical on the sheets. And so if you know what you're looking for, the data, the times, these tests are, so every machine self-tests at 4 a.m. every Monday. And if it self-tests and there are any issues, then the machine will shut itself down, at which time the technician needs to go out. If it self-tests fine, then that's what these technicians are supposed to be validating. So there are very specific pieces of information that should be the same on every single report that comes in. The other problem that has been discovered is the fact that although we do receive original documentation, that documentation does not come to us as immediately as the documentation from the technician. That report that comes from the technician is essentially a scanned PDF file that then gets emailed to us. And so now, the time-consuming aspect of this is to take all of the reports that were submitted by these technicians and compare them to the original documentation. So it is not possible for them to manipulate the generated tickets. So what they have generated is the initial report.
Thank you, Senator Vanderwall. Senator Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Colonel Gasper. I have a question about your official statement, paragraph 3. There's a sentence that is confusing me. Maybe it's because I don't understand the system well enough. The sentence is, while the discrepancies do not directly impact or deal with the results of evidential breath tests, it is concerning that it appears as though some certification records have been falsified. So my question is, are the results of these breath tests not used for evidence, or how is it that these discrepancies are not impacting the results of the evidential breath test? It would seem to me that the certification must be linked to the value of the evidence.
Yes, thank you for the question. That's an important question. The issue that we were attempting to address there was the fact that when the calibration is done, if the calibration is not done, that does not automatically mean that the test was inaccurate, but it could potentially be inadmissible because it's outside of the time period that it was calibrated. And so from that perspective, that test could be considered inadmissible. That would obviously not be for us to weigh in on that. That would be the prosecutor's office or the judges or the court system in the state. But from the perspective of that test, as I referenced earlier, that is not the only piece of information that validates or invalidates a drunk driving arrest.
So in other words, the lack of certification records could result in evidence being inadmissible and not available in court. Yet you're saying that the discrepancies don't directly or indirectly deal with the results. I mean, to me, this creates at least a impression in my mind when I read this sentence that the results weren't implicated. But in fact, if the results are unavailable to be used in court, they were in fact affected by the failures around certification. Is that fair?
They could be, definitely. Our intent was just not to speak for the prosecutors or the court system.
Thank you, Senator Irwin. Senator Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Colonel, for being here. So following up on Senator Irwin's remarks or questions, it doesn't suggest that the Datamaster was not rendering the proper output. It was that we couldn't validate that based on the time that had elapsed from the last certification. Is that more or less true?
Yes, sir.
And do you suspect that this was done out of just laziness by the vendors that didn't care to go out and recalibrate it, so they falsified the records to indicate that they had when they truly hadn't?
That is what we suspect.
And it wasn't an intent to fraudulently rig the device, it was just more or less carelessness or laziness on their part to suggest that they had done something that they truly had not done.
Yes, sir.
How do we know with certainty going forward or retrospectively that other instances of this haven't occurred and that there's been this perhaps deviation or drifting away from the certainty of what is reported out of the machine? You know, if we look at the records and say, okay, it's been validated every, I think you said 90 days, correct?
Every 120 days.
Every
yes, sir.
120 days. And we have a record that shows that, but if that's merely a paper document that we've already determined is not accurate, how do we know that that machine is now rendering the proper output if in fact the certification of that can't be truly counted on? There could be a gradual discrepancy that is stretched over time, if you will.
Right, so the process from prior to, we have no indication prior to the hiring of these two individuals, based on the work that MSP has done where they receive the reports from the technician and then they obviously review those reports for accuracy and then compare those to the original documentation too. So prior to the fall of 2018, there were no indications based on the analysis that was being conducted that there were any irregularities that were detected.
Okay. When the calibration is recertified or done, does the manufacturer deliver a sample that the machine is tested or verified against? So basically that when they do that, is it just a computer verification or is it an actual, like, we have a sample that we're going to put through the machine, we know what the sample should read because the manufacturer delivered it that way, and we will gauge that against what the machine actually puts out?
Yes, sir, we're getting slightly out of my area of expertise, honestly. I'm not a scientist, but from what I understand, yes, it's a highly technical calibration that takes into account instrumentation and chemicals within the device, as well as even barometric pressure to identify whether or not that machine is calibrated correctly.
Okay. So there is a scientific, it's not just a computer, like you turn it on, run a few things, and it puts out, yeah, everything's testing fine, but in
No,
reality,
sir.
it could be, we have to know that whatever person breathing into that machine, the output of that is truly what their level of intoxication truly actually is.
Yes, sir.
And then, do we ever have instances where the Datamaster and the blood tests do not align with one another?
I'm not aware of that. It is, I guess, potentially possible, but I'm not aware of any situations.
Okay. Wanted to ask you, if I may continue, Mr. Chairman. Of course, I'm sure you're well familiar that Vice Chair Chang and I have bills related to the Forensic Science Lab and Forensic Science Commission. I know your department's had pretty strong opposition to that. Do you feel that in light of these revelations that perhaps, an outside body having more authority in this matter could help alleviate these circumstances from occurring in the future?
In this particular situation, based on what I know of the proposed Forensic Science Commission, this situation would not have resulted in a difference because some type of entity, presumably the state police, would have had to bring this issue to the commission. So again, we would more or less be in the same situation of being reactive to the situation versus being proactive.
Okay. you may be familiar with the Criminal Defense Attorney Association, and Mike Nichols, one of their attorneys, has petitioned the governor to move the crime lab out of the state police based on what he considers to be not valid results and some, evidence that he uncovered that showed, a retesting of results that may have had a residual carryover effect. I don't know or understand all the science behind that, but have you kind of reviewed that or responded in some way?
Yes, I have reviewed it, and again, to get into the science of it, a little out of my scope and my expertise. What I will say is that from a perspective of the relationship, regardless of where the forensic science sits, they are always going to have a particular relationship with members of the criminal justice system, because that's what they're doing. They're doing the criminal justice work for prosecutors and for defense attorneys and for the court system. So there will always be a particular relationship there. From a standpoint of the case with residuals, we are an accredited lab. We are, our results are and our standards are higher than the industry standard. Because we do hold ourselves in a very high regard to make sure that we are providing those lab services. All of our reports are completely transparent. Our processes are transparent, and we've provided the same documentation for decades that indicates how we sample, and the sampling of samples multiple times is within the industry standard, which is within accreditation, which is ultimately what is done around the world. So we do stand behind our strict internal controls and where we are with our accreditation.
So is there anything in that specific instance that was improper that was done, or are you saying you stand behind that, even that sample that was done 4 times and only 1 was reported or something to that effect?
Yes, sir. I completely stand behind it. We don't discard the samples. It's science, and it does speak for itself.
Okay. Lastly, this is something that's taken on an interest of mine. The governor, in the most recent budget, stripped out protections for employees that contact legislators on issues of concern to them. I have a bill pending that would restore those statutorily, but they were taken out of the budget. Can we have a commitment from you that you would not punitively officers that choose to contact lawmakers for
It's important to maintain open lines of communication, and that, that is how ultimately the process works, so that we can best serve the citizens of the state of Michigan.
I take that as a yes?
I'm a firm believer in communication, sir.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, Senator Barrett. Different than the military, isn't it? Senator Chang.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Then we're going to get on after Senator Runstead to take some testimony.
I guess 2 questions that I was thinking about. On this page, you have the list of the dates from which you've already identified problems based on the review of vendor records. I was just curious, like, what percentage of vendor records have already been identified? And I'm just trying to get a sense of, like, how many more problems we might be identifying later on. So that was the first question. Then the second question was around the August case. I note that it wasn't discovered until November, when the prosecutor in Montcalm County contacted you all. I was just curious about how that time, like, what happened within those 3 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't speak to the specifics of the Montcalm case. What I can say is that, and again, part of our frustration is the inability to be able to provide clear and concise information about, just how many people are going to be affected with this. We are actively going through all of the data, and my commitment, the state police commitment to everyone is that at the very moment that we discover discrepancies or irregularities, there will be notification as possible with this so that we can answer some of these issues. And I understand that the sensitivity and the frustration and the angst that many people in the state have to deal with while we're going through this.
Thank you, Senator Chang. Senator Runstead?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to the forensic interview hearing, I was impressed with MSP and also Oakland County and how you operate. I don't have that level of confidence in some private vendor. I don't know if it's possible, but is it possible somehow to bring this internal so that we don't have to depend upon a vendor who may have some loony people in the back room who are just fast asleep? Is it cost prohibitive for you to bring this inside the MSP?
No, sir. That is our plan. Our plan is to bring it in-house with 3 technicians. So we would completely take over the program to be able to ensure the quality of people that we're hiring and the strict internal controls to make sure that the reports and the data that they are recording are being looked at not only by supervisors, but also external entities such as an external scientist and our auditor.
Thank you. And finally, what was the crimes? I noticed in the back page, it's a possible criminal act. What would be the charge in these cases?
So at this point, the case that we're looking at currently is the forgery of a public document.
What is the penalty for that?
I'm not sure, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Runstead. 2 last questions. Number 1, contract. Does it cover just the vendors, or does it cover their staff that are supposed to supply the vendor with the assistance?
So it is a somewhat complicated contract that through legislation and administrative rules, the contract provides that the vendor or the owner of the instrument has to provide the training for the instrument. So we're working with the Attorney General's office and DTMB to manage through and obviously an unforeseen situation and how we can navigate that.
Next, how many out-of-state vendors does Intoximeter Inc. handle?
I'm not familiar with that, sir.
Okay, thank you. So next? One last question. Go ahead, Senator.
I believe in New Jersey it was that they had to discard a large number of breathalyzer or Datamaster convictions or, DUI-related offenses. How did that situation differ than what we're looking at with this instance?
I've not had an opportunity to review the specifics of the New Jersey situation, so I could review that and definitely report back, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Barrett. At this time now, we're going to take some testimony from Michael Nichols, from Michael Nichols Law Firm. Sir, welcome to committee, and I know you're with your client, Patrick Reynolds, correct?
Senator, correct. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's not the Michael Nichols Law Firm, it's the Nichols Law Firm. My wife Wendy would kill you if she heard you say that.
I apologize.
That's okay.
Nichols Law Firm, husband and wife.
And I am a member of the Criminal Defense Attorneys of Michigan Rules and Laws Committee. Of course, I speak on my own behalf.
Microphone close.
Microphone?
Yeah, it just will hear you better.
I'm also a member of the National College for DUI Defense. I have been a faculty member for the college. I'm on their National Forensic Science Committee. I'm the author of the OWI Handbook for Michigan Lawyers by Thomson Reuters West and an adjunct faculty member at WMU Cooley. I'm not on the other side today. I appreciate you, Colonel. I think we're all on the same side today. There's not going to be a verdict here or an order from a judge. Perhaps there'll be some amendments to legislation or some action taken. perhaps some prosecutions that may flow, but I appreciate the fact that this has been brought to this point. Important preliminary comment. Michigan is essentially stuck with intoximeters because intoximeters doesn't make this instrument. They never did. They make different types of instruments that are similar to the Datamaster. The Datamaster was manufactured and created by National Patent Analytical Systems in Ohio, who was used for about 20 years. And NPAS sold to intoximeters. I believe I had a conversation with Sergeant Perry Curtis in about 2014. So there was about a 3-year phase-out from NPAS monitoring these calibration checks and the records and reporting those to the state police, and former Sergeant Curtis, who was at that time in charge of the alcohol enforcement unit. So phasing out from those 3 service techs who were provided by NPAS, these are the individuals who do these 120-day checks and the maintenance on the instrument, to September 1st, 2018, when intoximeters took over the service and maintenance of this instrument that they did not manufacture, and the state entered into that $1.26 million contract. I embedded a link to that contract in my written statement that has been provided to all of you. That written statement was also approved and reviewed by a scientist named Andreas Stoltz, who I've cited there. He could not be here today because he's got a really bad cold. We have an opportunity as a result of the public discourse generated by this breath test, we'll just say mini scandal or scandal, whatever you want to call it, to take a look at how we gather and analyze and use this type of forensic evidence in Michigan courtrooms. I've probably tried over 100 DUI trials in my 20 years as a trial attorney, and there are a lot of things that we could do better and a lot of things that we can do differently. And I'm not here to bash state police or law enforcement. I think many police officers want to do a good job, and they're underappreciated in how they're compensated and the typical general public view of law enforcement. They do heroic things. But this is about asking you to consider some questions. I've laid it out in the statement, and I think some of you have already contemplated this, and perhaps the legislation that was already reported out of this committee, I think it was PA 276, or Senate Bill 276, the Chang-Barrett bill, the Forensic Science Commission bill, could be 276 and 277, thank you. That could be a vehicle for this. And we've already talked about it a little bit, and that is taking forensic testing, especially chemical testing, out of the ambit of the Department of State Police and putting it into a different department. Other states do that. I consulted with a colleague in Ohio to confirm that in Ohio, it's the Department of Public Health that writes the rules for these calibration checks and certifications and maintains at least one of their breath test instruments. Ohio uses 2 different breath test instruments. One is the Datamaster, the other is, I think it's called the Intox 5000. My phone has been blowing up, and my email and my social media since about 7:30 a.m. Saturday when all this came out, with not just public citizens but other lawyers and some police officers. What do we do? What do we do about this? And I know what the colonel just reported and what's been reported in the media, and my background from my familiarity with this method and this process. But the reason to move forensic science and chemical testing out of the MSP, it's twofold. One is the general appearance that you've got law enforcement hovering over or regulating and overseeing forensic science. The other is the actual, you've got to serve 2 masters. One is the science when you're doing a blood alcohol analysis or inspecting one of these devices. It's supposed to be about science. And the other is the fact that no one can ever just forget about the fact that their paycheck comes from a law enforcement agency. As I said in my written statement, the record to how you maintain these instruments, these calibration checks, there's a weekly check that it's done by a dry gas tank that's connected to the instrument, and then there's these 120-day checks. The 120-day checks are required by the administrative rules that legislation required the state police to promulgate these rules, and they've been in effect for decades, and they've been modified over recent years. And in my opinion, I feel like sometimes the modifications are simply more for convenience, for doing your job and using it in court, which perhaps breeds what Senator Barrett asked about, the perceived laziness by a contractor. The calibration checks are at the heart, not just record keeping, but demonstrating that the measurement is reliable. That's a scientific concept called traceability. Very simple analogy is your bathroom scale. If you set a 15-pound weight on your bathroom scale, you need to know how that is determined to be a 15-pound weight. And to address, I think it was Senator Vanderwall's point maybe, those standards, those known alcohol solutions that are used out there in the field are provided by a different vendor, which is important because you don't want this provider also giving you the standards that are introduced to show the accuracy of its own piece of equipment. That's not good, sound science. So when they're out there in the field and they're doing these 120-day checks, they're using it's called a simulator solution. I wish we would have had a simulator jar. It's literally a jar that's got the standard inserted into it. They do different ranges, so you've got a linear range of accuracy that you can report, 0.04, 0.08, 0.20. In the water bath, it's called a wet bath, and I've got the administrative rules cited in your written materials. And it's very temperature dependent, and the operator has to mix the simulator solution with that known standard of alcohol at each of the required data points, and then insert it by blowing it into the instrument, and the instrument reports a response. For example, 0.10. I observed this, the instrument speaking, at a 0.115, for example. So you need to know what that is, and you need to know how you did it, and you need to know how you maintain the temperature of your fluid. That's critical, because the science shows that 1 degree centigrade difference in that temperature in that simulator solution can alter either higher or lower by 7% the result. So you've got your bathroom scale looking at a 15-pound weight and maybe calling it a 10-pound weight or a 20-pound weight. Either way, somebody who's guilty may look not guilty in terms of their breath alcohol content, and vice versa. Somebody who's not guilty may look guilty. So that's why these calibration checks and this record-keeping issue, and I'm really glad that an audit found it, that's why this is important, and that's how Senator Irwin, it could actually, could result affect the accuracy of your result. My second recommendation is that if we do not keep the contract with intoximeters, if we either scrap it or keep it, we need to review these administrative rules. And perhaps if we get the Science Commission passed and adopted and put into law, that the commission could have as one of its charges a body of scientists, not just, defense attorneys like me, because I'm not a scientist, I just play one in the courtroom. Senator Lucino, I'm sure you've been there when you've been in private practice. Scientists, law enforcement, defense attorneys, members of the public, to take a look at how to analyze the administrative rules and have administrative rules that are not touched unless those rules are reviewed by actual scientists. And if you look at the history of the administrative rules, you'll see all the years that they've been changed, and look at the changes and wonder why. Why did they change it so that a 15-minute observation period doesn't have to be a true observation period? To me, it's about convenience, not about science. Third, I think we should take a look at the science, and this gets a little bit deep into the weeds. But we've got legislation that says 0.08 grams of alcohol per 210 liters of breath is presumed to be a violation of this act. And then the administrative rule that's incorporated by reference says, well, breath means essentially alveolar air, which is air from the deep lung region of your body. That's what the instrument is supposed to be identifying. And I would suggest that perhaps we need to change it so that it's fair for everybody, including juries, prosecutors, judges, and people charged with the offense, so that it's 0.08 grams of alcohol per 210 liters of the person's body as estimated by a breath test, because we know it's nothing more than an estimate. A lot has to happen and not have anything affect it when you're delivering a sample of your breath from the lower part of your lungs into the instrument. I've watched hundreds of breath tests. It takes a long time, and I've seen people start coughing and choking when they're trying to deliver a long, steady stream of breath at the officer's direction. In terms of moving the forensic science and the chemical testing from the MSP, from the Department of State Police, it affects both breath and blood, and the travesty that we had that Mr. Reynolds was convicted in a conviction that stood for from May 21st to December 6th. You know, in this case, it was a person convicted of a misdemeanor drunk driving with a 180-day maximum possible penalty. But tomorrow it could be somebody who's charged with a capital offense where there was unfortunately an accident and somebody was hurt or killed. In that case, that was a real example of people who want to do the right thing, well-intentioned people who felt so much pressure to get the two, and I'm talking now about blood testing in the Forensic Science Division. They had two instruments that were left in late 2018, two instruments that were functioning at the time. And they were working so hard to figure out carryover in blood samples and retention time shifting, which can affect the actual identification of what you're trying to identify, alcohol. They took the blood alcohol room out of commission for at least 11 days. And they were scrambling to try to get these last two instruments back up and running. To me, I would have said, legislature, we got to take alcohol testing down. We need a review of our resources because those two instruments are old and they're antiquated. We need to take a look at our staffing. Give us more resources. Instead, they scrambled to get these things back online. They don't resolve, they don't figure out their carryover problem. They don't figure out their retention time shifting problem. They just change the protocols without following their master document about how to take action when these things are occurring. And then they never told anybody about it, a Brady violation. And that's why Mr. Reynolds got a new trial and fortunately a different result. But he went through a long, hard, I think it was 6 months, Patrick? Of having to walk around with that conviction and a suspended license. A Brady violation is where the government's obligated to give you information that's material to either innocence or impeachment, and it's not provided. And it's imputed to the prosecutor even if the prosecutor doesn't know the information is there. That's a case, People versus Chanel from the Supreme Court. So that was a real-life example that really, it turned my stomach because the supervisor who testified, I think he's a good person, a well-meaning person. But what he did was inexcusable, and it robbed the jury of the information that they needed to hear to make an informed verdict, and it robbed Mr. Reynolds of a fair trial. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Before we get started, I know Senator Johnson, you have some questions. I have just has the state ever had an independent review of the Datamasters?
I'm not sure on that, sir.
Can you get me, or in this committee, an answer on that? I want to know if there's ever been an independent review, audit of the Datamasters. And secondly, did it include the software? Was the software ever reviewed? And then the last thing is, for both of them, so if you don't have the answer, we want the answer. Other instruments and options. Is there other instruments or options that can be brought to the state's attention
Yes, there are.
to do a better job, have more reliability in the performance, and at the end of the day, all of us in the criminal justice arena rely on it?
Yes.
Could you get us the information on that and the cost if you can?
Yes, sir.
Because I'm sure you're probably looking into it.
We are.
All right. And then the last thing is, your department, to Senator Barrett's point, the state police houses, so if I do a blood draw over at Mount Clemens Macomb Hospital, Henry Ford Macomb Hospital, the blood is taken in the vials, it's sealed pursuant to instructions of the state police, and sent to the crime lab, correct?
Yes, sir.
And this is done in all 83 counties.
Yes, sir.
That would be the same with urine? Urine the same,
Yes, sir.
as well as if there is not a blood draw or urine, then the breathalyzer itself is still overseen by the state police.
Yes, sir.
So all three of these, in regards to criminal justice in drunk driving or drug driving or any kind of drugs or alcohol in a system, all is within the purview of the state police.
Yes, sir.
All right, that's it. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering if the science is the same of what you're talking about on the breathalyzers that are installed in people's cars because they've been court-ordered.
Different. It's different. And it's a long explanation, and I don't fully understand how those instruments in the cars work. I believe they're just simply a fuel cell that responds to an energy change in the breath sample. The evidential breath testers, we'll call them, so that would include a Datamaster or any other manufacturer. It's based on infrared spectrophotometry, which is a long word, but it basically means it absorbs infrared light.
I know that we did have a vendor that, for the Secretary of State's office, that we were getting a lot of complaints about
I
false
recall that.
positives
Yes.
and also false negatives. And we had to immediately stop using that. And all the people that had the breathalyzers in their cars had to go get all new ones installed, which was a very significant cost. And of course, it wasn't their fault. The vendors'
I recall that.
equipment simply failed at a very high rate, which is not going to protect people if somebody's blowing and it shows nothing. And of course, it's so unfair if somebody blows and it shows a positive and it's a negative. So maybe the whole package should be looked at because we didn't really have a specialty for that kind of equipment within our own staff. They do a great job, but
Sure.
it was because of this constant reporting. And of course, it's very often that people will report that they were not drinking and that there was a false positive, which many times is not accurate. They have kids blow in, and one guy even tried to have a raccoon blow into it for him. So, you know, the system is not always perfect
one of
for
my
sure,
clients.
but our equipment should certainly be accurate. Thank you.
Yes, and Senator, a quick point about that. All of these instruments are generally the same theory on which they operate. When we bought the Datamaster in about 2010, we turned off a lot of its features. So you could see like the graphic display of the breath coming in with the alcohol curve. And to me, that's important. Let's have more information, not less.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Just to conclude, unless there's more questions coming, but we'll be right with you, Senator Barrett. I need to know timelines because I know we're going to get calls, we're going to be asked by constituents, we're going to be asked by defense lawyers, possibly even police. How long are we talking about to finish your job to go out and get the records and review them for 203 breathalyzers with 3 personnel? I think you said 3 that you have with the state police.
Yeah, so the review of the data, I do not have an estimation on that. From a standpoint of getting the data masters back online, as I indicated, we have 37 online in a matter of a couple of days, and so we anticipate, hopefully within the next 30 days to be able to have all of them back online and calibrated. But again, there are a lot of different intricacies that could slow that
I
down.
appreciate that. I know that this has caused you heartburn, okay? But at the end of the day, we have to ensure that justice is served. Lastly, in regards to, are you recommending to all of the 203 breathalyzers that are out there, the people that do their job, the service of officers, not to use and go with blood?
So for those machines that have not been calibrated in the last couple of days by the state police, yes, we are recommending that law enforcement utilizes a blood draw.
I don't even want to ask you because you're going to say I have no idea. Do you have an idea of what this third-party vendor who was doing the work for the state, independently contracted from the state police through the state of Michigan, is going to cost us for this malfeasance? I'll use that word. Negligence, I'll get there. But ultimately, when you falsify a document to the state, it becomes a criminal act. Do you have any idea what the cost is going to be on this?
I do not have an idea of the cost from a standpoint of the state police. We do have a mechanism in place to keep track
Track
of
the
ours, but that does not take into account putting the value on those affected outside of law enforcement.
I appreciate your answers. Thank you. Senator Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Mr. Nichols, appreciate your testimony. Is it, it sounds like you're suggesting that the Datamaster, based on like your volume of breath, maybe, you know, you're congested at the time and you spew out some, you know, saliva into it that could skew the data or something like that. Why don't we just test everybody's blood instead of going through this breath instead that's got to be calibrated every 120 days and all that other stuff? Why don't we just draw blood, everybody's blood volume, you know, you draw a specific volume of blood into a vial. That's not questionable as to how much you put out. I mean, it's a measured volume. Why do we do the Datamaster? And I guess that's a fair question for both of you. If we could draw blood, and based on your comments on the blood testing that was done for your client, do you feel confident that today's blood testing is accurate?
Well, an important point is most cases will have either breath or blood, not both. And I have never seen a urine case, ever.
What? I'm
A
sorry.
urine case.
Yeah.
But to your point, to me, I think the whole advent of breath alcohol testing forensically to investigate, prosecute, and go to court on was because it's just less invasive and more convenient for the officers. I believe it's generally accepted science. I'm not going to say it's junk science at all. I would never say that. But every single instrument, no matter who the manufacturer is, it's only as effective and accurate as those of us, and I'll say all of us, who use it and what we understand and are willing to tell the end user, the jury, about its usefulness, its accuracy, what it tells us, et cetera.
Okay, and I guess to my other question.
Did I just give you a lawyer's answer? Or did
Do you feel that the current, I mean, based on the circumstance of your client, a couple of years ago, has that issue been remedied, or is there still this issue of this carryover effect and the other
Sure.
things?
I mean, I'm going to be very frank. I don't believe that they've cured it, and I think they would tell you the same. They have changed how they report it. So the ultimate result is, what kind of case is it going to be an issue? And usually it's going to be a case where the blood alcohol estimate is close to one of the legal thresholds in Michigan, 0.02, 0.04. Remember, commercial motor vehicle carriers, it's 0.04, 0.08, or 0.17.
Okay, so if you were at like a .09, you
Sure.
could dispute that potentially and call into question some of that and
Right.
whether or not it was, you
Right.
know, and again, I don't understand all the, I assume it means that, you know, a sample is done and the next sample may have the residual from the previous sample or
Yes.
something that was tested.
Because they analyze them in a batch. There are typically 70 vials, unknowns from people who were arrested, calibrators, controls, and then negative samples, which are supposed to be really just water. So when you see a peak in a sample that's supposed to be a negative, like in this case, that's how you discover that, okay, we may have carryover here. But you're right, a .09, you may have a carryover issue, but a .12, some
not.
other defense if it's there.
Yeah. And then, could not a forensic science commission contemplate all of these and develop standards and protocols and practices and other things, just if nothing else, to give certainty to the public and to law enforcement that these are done in a best practice fashion?
Absolutely, no matter what comes
In a
out.
non-adversarial way, too. I mean,
Right.
I don't think it in and of itself is adversarial to law enforcement to add a layer of certainty to that.
I mean, I'm just one citizen, and I don't think I'm your constituent. I think I'm close, but
So I don't have to be nice to you.
no, I think I'm Hertel's district. But I mean, it seems from all of the social media inbox messages and posts and emails and phone calls that I've been getting, I walked out of here with my receptionist saying, boy, business is really good, Mike. And I said, well, not really, because, some of those people are in the UP. I can't possibly go up there. But the point is, it's almost as if we're on the brink. This was a great step by the colonel of a public confidence crisis with drunk driving cases, especially breath cases. And a forensic science commission, I think, would go a long way to help us understand what we need to do differently and better to have convictions that we can really trust at the
Right,
end
because
of
there's
the day.
certainly those that deserve to be convicted and absolutely
Right.
deserve the full penalties associated with that, and then those that are, not every arrest leads to a conviction, and there's a lot of in between there, so.
Unless
Thank you,
there's a-
Senator Barrett.
Yeah,
In the
thank you both.
meantime, we've got just a few minutes. I want to get to Mr. Reynolds before I get to the last question from our committee member, Senator Vanderwall. Patrick Reynolds, is there anything you want to say? Because you came here today, I know your lawyer's with you, but is there something you want us to know?
Yes, good morning. I just want to, I made a mistake, and I own that. But the way that the evidence from my case was handled and mishandled, and the lack of transparency from the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, it caused, if that information had been given to the jury, there's probably a pretty good chance I wouldn't have been convicted because it caused doubt. The lab technician said he was 100% confident in the results of my blood. And how could you be confident if you had to shut down the whole crime lab because of issues that you were having? I mean, because of all that, I missed multiple days of work because of that for trials. I lost the job that I had for 10 years because I ultimately lost my license. And living in Lansing at the time and working in Grand Rapids, it's hard to get to work when you don't have a license. It put more stress in my marriage and ultimately resulted in divorce. I got a second job, and because of more court appearances, I lost that job. I now have a great job, which I'm back on my feet. In the process of losing my license, I regained my license, but it wasn't reported by the Secretary of State through their computer, and I was pulled over again, returning from Lansing from dropping off my son, and the police officer, thank God, he was kind of familiar with my case through the news, and he believed my story, and he just wrote me an appearance instead of arresting me or impounding my vehicle, etc. I had another court appearance for that, and ultimately it got dismissed when I spoke with the prosecutor and the judge. I just want to make sure that nobody else goes through this. I mean, I made a mistake. I own it 100%. I'm not saying that I didn't make a mistake. But I think that as citizens, we should be able to trust the process that goes into us being convicted or being found not guilty. I mean, if the transparency's there, us as private citizens will have a fair trial.
Thank you. I appreciate your words. I truly do. I know it means a lot to come here and speak.
Yes,
Not every day people come before this committee, and it's nerve-wracking.
it is.
Senator Vanderwall, I think we're going to follow you right out the door after your
Right,
questions.
thank you very much. Just really two brief statements and one question. It's, I give the state police a lot of credit. Because of your internal checks and balances, you found issues and and you held that and pulled that out so that we would make sure that we didn't have issues. Now, the next question goes for Mr. Nichols. Do other states use forensic scientists, commissions to do the breath or the alcohol checks? Or is that something that we've used or haven't used?
If you mean an independent entity to monitor calibration checks?
Correct.
My understanding is yes, Ohio being one. I believe many Texas counties have an independent body.
Do you, and I guess then I'll go back. The back check on some of this with the forensics, it's kind of what Senator Barrett and Chang have been talking about in their bills.
Yeah, we're definitely looking at all options. I think it's very important to do a thorough review, particularly in light of everything that's happened.
I just want to say thank you again for all of you, and thank you for taking the time to come today. Appreciate it.
Appreciate your testimony. Thank you for joining us in committee. Members of the committee, if there's no further business before the committee now stands adjourned.